Welcome. I'm Jessica Tejan, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. I want to welcome back our Evolving to Exceptional listeners to this new episode of the podcast. We have a really interesting new guest with us, Jason, who is going to talk with us a little bit about this a really exciting project he's doing in modernizing and focusing on performance management, how to bring that to the current state. But before we get into the details of that, Jason, give us a little bit about your background, what it is that you do, and why it is that you do it.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, thanks for having me. It's really exciting. I always like geeking out over performance management and really just things involving people excellence in general. Really, I'm not going to go through the whole litany of things, but my career really just spans HR across 20 plus years. And I'm really, all of my focus, people always talk about, what have you done in HR? And really, I've done a little bit of everything, but really, if there's one theme or kind of thread that ties through everything, it's really this idea of improvement. I started traditionally as a classroom trainer back in the yonder days. I'm aging myself. And even improvement there always talks about doing needs assessment and improving skills and helping train people, those types of things. But really my responsibilities and where I really felt like I found my niche was when I started more working along the lines of improving the organization and looking at team improvement. And so a lot of my work migrated because a lot of my skill sets of communication and strategy really migrated into the organizational development and consulting fields. And that's really led me to the things that I really enjoy today. I know we're going to talk a lot about performance management and systems and things like that. And that's just one piece, but really this really is just a passion of mine, is how do we untap that excellence that all of us have, and every single one of us. And that really has led to even a lot of the work I've done in performance management as well. So that's just a quick summary and where I'm at and what I enjoy doing.
Yeah, and you have a fascinating career. You've worked in a lot of different industries, different sectors, different types of roles in the people and performance space. Tell us a little bit about what it is that you're currently doing and maybe a little bit about why that's such a critical focus.
Yeah, and it really does align with what I had just mentioned before in my introduction. A lot of my focus right now is both in consulting and in what I call my everyday job is just really looking at the processes and the different people approaches that we have in organizations. And really one of my big focuses right now is looking at that performance management process. And you mentioned the modernization. To me, performance management is a constant modernization, constant evolution of evaluating what are you currently doing and how can we continue to make it better. And again, to me, that focus is really landed on the idea of how do we, I don't want to say motivate people. I don't like to use that word because I feel like people motivate themselves, but how do we create that environment where people can be at their best? And that's really the approach I take when I'm looking at any kind of processes, and specifically in performance management, is looking at what's currently in place and looking at what are some of these different methods you're using. And that's what I always do, is I always want to evaluate the current state. Well, what's going on? How long have you been doing it? Give me some background, but then I really want to experience it. Let me sit through, a process, a review, a rating, whatever that is and whatever that looks like. And then also I like to talk to the people actually doing that process. So talking to the first line leaders, the managers, how it feels to them, what do they like and don't like, and then also going into the employees as well and discussing from their standpoint, how valuable do they think it is. And from there, I like to take all that data and then really look at some of the approaches I like to take and try to infuse, and making sure that aligns with the organization, because I think that's an important piece too. There's lots of different ways you can do this, but it really does need to align with what the company's values are, the organizational values, one, and then two, what is the company ready for? And sometimes there's lots of different things that I want to come in and with approaches or things that I want to implement. But sometimes just like change, you can do too much too fast. And so maybe it's an evolution approach. And we talk about that phased approach sometimes as well.
One of the things I think that's interesting is I recently, a while back, I looked at definitions of performance management and how that definition has changed over the years. It's been different in different phases of talent or HR history. When you're talking about performance management, can you give us just a description of what it is you're referring to today when you're talking about performance management?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because I think it's foundational. And for me, I don't even like using the term performance management so much. Even when I talk about consulting, companies reach out to me, they'll use the term performance management. And I like to clarify for them, what do they exactly mean? I like to talk about it more from an approach of a performance system. For me, performance management gets into the correcting performance issues, whether that's a performance improvement plan or as an assigning of an annual performance rating. And that's absolutely can be a part of a system. But for me, a performance management system that we're looking at is really, what does this look like over a longer process? And it's a continued cycle. It's not a linear approach. And that's really what I talk through when I'm working with organizations. This isn't we go from step 1 to step 2, or we move from a beginning of the year to a mid-year review to an annual review. It really is just an evolution. And to me, it's really a partnership. That management system process is a partnership between the leader and the employee. And that partnership really is going to be, the leader's their role is, let me establish expectations with you. Let me talk about what I need you to do, what you were hired to do. My role in that is I'm going to continue to give you feedback, not just 1 or 2 times a year during those formal rating process times potentially, but I'm going to continue to give you feedback. I'm going to be here to help remove obstacles and barriers that may come in your way. And if we feel like there's a gap there, or maybe you're not performing even to your satisfaction, let's talk about what is the core root of that. And then I'm going to help you put a plan in place to make sure you get there. And to me, that's that management system piece that really is that approach of, it's a continual evolving thing that should be continuing to happen throughout the year all the time.
I really love your definition there of it being a system. One of the things that I think comes up for people when you think about the term performance management, and even if we focus on the management piece of that, is that kind of like power over, or that vertical relationship. And when we're in that type of relationship, we're not coming together equally to the engagement, right? It is one person, and management's important, I think, to execution of tasks and projects and systems, computer systems, or how a particular process works. You do need to manage those things. But when it comes to people, when you're in that vertical relationship, we know that changes the dynamic, right? Of how people engage in those interactions and how effective then those interactions are to actually impacting performance. And so I love that you call it a system, and you emphasize that it's important to view it in that partner-based model. And that's one of the models that we really use too. And we talk about having this partnering, and not even just, I think, between the leader and the person, but also between people who are just working together. Because sometimes I think we make performance management about this, again, only the vertical relationship, the manager to the employee, and we forget about how much work actually is getting done peer to peer, person to person, cross functionally to execute, especially in today's more complex environment.
Yeah, and I love a couple points you hit on there. The first of all, that partnership, and you're absolutely right. In traditional performance, I'm gonna call it management or call it systems, is it really does. There's this hierarchy. I'm the leader, you're the employee, and that partnerships that can fracture that partnership. And what I talk a lot with leaders about when it truly is a partnership, I'm huge on neuroscience and this idea of trying to make sure it's a psychological safe place for both the employee and the manager. And really, this goes to a psychological safety, is it's a status thing. If I feel like my status isn't equal to yours in this partnership, you're never going to get the best out of me. And the intents can Contentious can be great, but it really does. We have to remove status, and it really should just be a partnership and a collaboration of what I do have in my power as a leader is to remove these obstacles and to give you feedback. But also, I need from you that feedback from you about how you feel like you're doing and how you feel like you're evolving and continuing to improve as well. And the second thing you mentioned is that idea of this feedback isn't always from the leader. And I love that concept as well. And that's one of the things we try to figure out. What's the best way to integrate that? Because in this complex, evolving world, more people working remotely, all these different things that come into play, and leaders having larger teams sometimes to even to lead, a leader's not going to know and can't be there overseeing every step by step everything that's going on. So they really do need to rely on, there's different systems that give them productivity numbers and stuff, and those things may be in place, but it goes back to the how the work is being done as well. And so much of that is that peer-to-peer colleagues being able to get feedback from them. And as an employee, what we talk to the employee about their role is you can solicit that feedback as well. Hey, I worked on this project with you. Give me some feedback. And not just say, how did I do? But specifically, how was my communication skills? Did I execute on the things that I was assigned to do? And the employee then can take that back to the leader when they're having these ongoing conversations to talk about that feedback and maybe to utilize it to say, okay, my time management wasn't as good on this project. What are some things I can do to improve my time management next time, or things like that?
Yeah, and I think feedback certainly, and I would even take it one step further in that we get more opportunities for growth and development when everybody's equipped to deliver that. And so if I can learn from my coworker, if I can have them help me when I'm in a negative mindset and they're equipped with how to engage and have that conversation in an effective way, and I don't have to tie up my manager every single time I'm having a struggle or a challenge, then that creates more bandwidth within the team. And what is everybody always after is more time, more ability to get things done. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning there too around the psychological safety component and that the kind of neuroscience piece. And for listeners who maybe aren't as familiar, if a person comes into a conversation and there's a level of fear that conversation might impact their status, it might impact their future promotion, or particularly their compensation, which is tied to security and safety for sure, that is going to shut down their ability to grow new neural connections, their ability to integrate what they're hearing into actual change or into actual growth as an individual. And so when we talk about partnership, it's not just because we like the idea of being in a partnership relationship. It is that when we can come into those conversations in a less threatening and more safe way, it actually changes the neurobiology of the participant in that conversation, which I think sometimes people don't realize the significance of. And so I love that you brought that out. And so while fear is one challenge, what are some of the other challenges that you see or that you have recognized with performance management or typical approaches that have maybe a negative rather than a positive impact on performance?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when I work with organizations, and one of the first things I see is what I call more traditional performance management, where it's rating based, where so much of the focus of the management or the system is at the end of the year, whether it's a calendar year or physical year, about this assignment of a rating, and then there may be a merit or some kind of money associated with that. So I think that's one big challenge that can come into play, is depending on how those are set up, where the focus is too much on that end product. And to me, going back to some of the science-based pieces, then there's no appreciation of the process, the growth that may have happened throughout the year. We are a results-based organization, and most organizations are. And so there's always got to be about, what did you accomplish? What did you achieve? I'm paying you to achieve results in your work. But to me, when the focus is so much on that excellent rating or your average, whatever the terminology is, that can really damage what we talked about, that conversation, those neurons as well in your brain forming. Because to me, it really is about trying to focus that conversation more around the growth mindset idea of not just what I accomplished. I want to celebrate your accomplishments and what you did great, but what am I also learning? Because if I'm building that, you talked about not always relying on your leader, that's a resilience piece, and that needs to be recognized as well. And if we can build resilience and I'm building skills or learning things about myself, about how I accomplish things or how I get work done, that's going to make me a more productive worker as well. And if the focus can be on, that's better if we're all doing that, that's better for the organization as a whole. So I think that really that focus around those ratings and trying to pull it away from that. So there are some organizations that still, are insistent that there needs to be a rating component of that. And I can work with that and we can talk about ways that we can still include those things. But to me, there has to be a way that the focus isn't on that end of the year term or 1 to 5 or whatever. And even worse is when you're rating on multiple things. I'm going to rate you on 10 different things, like every competency or every value or whatever, things like that. So that really to me has been some of the drawbacks on a lot of the traditional things I see.
And there's so much research to show that those ratings have more to do with the person doing the rating than the person receiving the rating, and their perceptions and their biases and their beliefs and how they are perceiving performance. And of course, yeah, it's gonna have a negative impact. There's tons of research showing it has a negative impact rather than a positive, which leads me to the question, and I'm curious of your thoughts on why so many organizations still do it. Why do they still have these annual review cycles? Why do they still do these ratings on competencies, and what does it take to convince them to stop?
I think it's honestly the most of the time when I ask that question, when I go into work with organizations, a lot of it is this is what they're used to. They've done it this way or a version of this way for a long time. So it's comfort. And I think that's the first thing. Anytime there's change, especially big change, when you talk about looking at a different way to approach performance, there's always some hesitancy there. And I think a lot of them just aren't honestly aware of the more modern research that's out there that you referenced around the damage that some of these reviews can do. So a lot of times, again, to me, it has to be with those types of organizations, it really does have to be a phased approach. You're not going to be unless I flip it like in one review cycle for them. That next review cycle, we're completely ditching ratings. But what I've tried to do with those companies that can be a little bit more hesitant and maybe still what I call living back in the 1980s, 90s, whatever you want to talk about, is let's talk about how can we maybe incorporate some of these neuroscience principles now, still maybe have that rating that you're traditionally used to, but let's just start phasing this in a little bit. So let's make sure that there's questions in there for the employee to reflect on their accomplishments and their growth and what they've done. And so sometimes it's just doing that phased approach. And then really a lot of times you have to show them the actual research and or how it's impacting their company. And sometimes that takes me going in doing focus groups with their employees, with their even first line leaders, because that's a lot of the perception as well, is especially from the senior leadership team, the executives, they feel like the employees may not like it, but our managers really do. And what you find out is they don't like it either. It's not a great process for anybody. They don't feel like they're equipped to distinguish between sometimes these rating levels. So that's one challenge. And like you said, is everybody has these natural common biases that we're all just privy to, the recency and all these different things that we bring into and just our interpretation of what excellent, what these different ratings mean, and showing them that by taking it a different way, we can remove a lot of these biases, most of them. We're making these more productive conversations, because to me that's the other big thing, the time spent on evaluating and rating all these different competencies. It can be hours sometimes for employees and leaders to have one conversation when you're doing all that. To me, there's time better spent. And if we can do this a different way, one, the conversations we're having are more productive, but two, it frees up to do other things and to do the stuff I'm paying you to do as well.
And I think what's interesting is if we go back to that, this performance management is really a system, and we want to think about it as a system, is that you have that system. No matter what, you have a system. And that system has developed based upon everybody's collective ways of working, the way that they make decisions, problems get solved, how work gets done, how people get promoted, how people learn and develop. All of those things create this kind of like system and way of working. And that system exists whether it's intentionally built or whether it's just a default as a result of all of those past histories and perspectives and practices. And I think what you're speaking to here is that these organizations are more comfortable with their current system, which has evolved over time. And the idea of intentionally changing that system creates discomfort, which again, we know is from neuroscience, that is a embodied reaction, that our bodies were wired to survive, that their primary purpose is to keep us alive, to survive. And one of the things that is really important in that is resources, is conserving our resources. And because throughout history we had less access to resources, food, shelter, companionship, those things, our bodies want to conserve energy. And so change requires energy. It requires our brains, it requires our investment, it requires energy. And so our natural reaction is to resist change, is to resist making those changes, because that's going to be more difficult than staying the same, even when the outcomes are better, even when ultimately it would be a better result. And so I think sometimes it's important to acknowledge, yeah, we expect this because it's a human reaction. It's not that anyone's bad, wrong, good. It's a human reaction. And then how do we help people adapt? How do we help people get more comfortable with change? Because to survive in the new world, the world that we're now living in, we have to be able to change and adapt. We can't stay the same anymore.
Yeah, and it's funny. What you summed it up really nicely. What I call it is when I go into work with organizations is what's your performance culture, and that's what
Yeah.
you're saying is what you naturally do with your thinking and your decision making. Our feedback plays into that as well. How do you give feedback here? How comfortable are we? What I call, are we nice? Do we just like to sugarcoat everything? And all those things play into that performance culture. And like you said, is culture to me is really simple. It's what you promote and what you allow to happen. And so when you talk about those things, and that framework is okay, when I go in and I do assessment, that's a part of it, is me looking at the culture and then talking about, now, what culture do you want to move to? We can talk about that and things, but it's also going to be an evolution, like you mentioned, is when change happens, it's going to be uncomfortable if we implement some of these changes. And we have to realize we're not going to get there immediately. And the other part of that is when we start to make some of these changes, making sure we stick with it and we're supporting it, whatever. Because again, if I don't promote it, if it's something like, oh, you can do that, or you don't really have to give that feedback, whatever, there can be different ways that can look, then you're not changing the culture. You're still not getting to where you need to be. This culture thing, and to me, it's funny because on all these listservs and a lot of things I'm seeing right now is this is becoming a lot more of a focus for organizations, especially, and I think it's what you referenced in these changing times. How do we create a culture of high performance? And that's everybody's focus. And it's just, to me, it's really hasn't been new. It's always been there. We've always been, or we continue to be asked to do more with less, is what I equate it to. But I feel like it, for leadership and especially for organizations, it really can be simplified to me for three ways. If you really want to move that direction or try to create this performance culture, it's really about some of the things we talked about. Psychological safety. Do we feel like we're all respecting some of those things that we talked about with status and autonomy and relatedness and fairness and things like that, and making sure that we can have these conversations and I'm not going to be punished in some way. And then there's this idea of growth mindset that we all have to realize we're going to make mistakes. We're all learning, but I understand that I feel comfortable that I can make a mistake and I'm not going to be hammered down for it. And then third is the accountability piece. And accountability doesn't have to be negative. A lot of people look at that as, oh, I'm going to terminate you or put you on some kind of discipline. For me, accountability is as simple as, what are my expectations in this role, in this job? What am I being asked to do? And give me my parameters, give me my box I'm being expected to work in. And a lot of that just goes back to those conversations with those leaders again. So to me, those are the three components we're really talking about and trying to build that performance culture.
And I often refer to this culture thing as a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem, in that people are impacted by the cultures in which they exist. That's how we evolve and grow in response to our experiences and our environments, our cultures. And people impact their cultures, right? So what people are doing and how they're behaving and how they're making decisions and all those things are creating the culture. And so what I think, and I see this happen time and time again, is we end up almost getting into like a finger pointing loop of, you got to fix the culture. No, we got to fix the people. No, we got to fix the culture. No, we got to fix the people. And they're so interrelated that if you aren't doing both together, the other negatively impacts or pulls people back. So I always use the example, if people are working on their limiting beliefs, or they're working on their accountability mindset or their growth mindset, but then they return to an environment that is unsafe, that is toxic, or has unconscious feedback or really negative interactions, that's going to drive them backwards, right? They're not able to thrive in a culture or an environment that's in contradiction to the way that they're evolving and growing themselves. And so I think it's interesting that we really have to, yes, make the culture changes or the system changes that can support that culture change, but then also figure out how individuals are breaking through and adapting and evolving themselves so that they can support those changes. So it's a little bit of a delicate dance or balance, I think.
No, I like your chicken and the egg analogy. The one I always use with leaders and talking to organizations is the dog chasing the tail. Is like, who's leading who? Sometimes you can't tell. You would always assume it's the head, the dog, and in case for the company, that's the senior leadership team or the execs. But a lot of times what they don't realize is how they would define the culture. And then you talk to the employees or you see what's actually happening. They're two very different things and they're not aligned.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then it's like you said, that push and pull of who's going to win out. And a lot of people say ultimately the execs will win out because they can make people changes or things like that. It actually can be the opposite as well, because if the people aren't supportive and if they're not feeling like they have the systems and the processes and the things in place to drive what they feel like is important, that the organization is not going to be successful. And when you don't have a successful organization, that's when changes at the top can even happen.
And I think you're absolutely right. I just did some research on a number of different avenues, and there's huge disconnects between leadership perception of what they're doing and what they have in place, and what individual people feel is actually happening. Whether that's the effectiveness of leadership development, whether that is change management, whether that is DE&I initiatives. There's this huge disconnect between perception of leaders and perception of the bulk of the people population. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we refuse to acknowledge that disconnect and understand why it exists, understand why leaders are viewing the organization from a completely different perspective than individual performers or individuals are viewing their experience in the organization. And one of the things I want to ask you about is I've seen this a lot, and there's been a lot of trends for a long time of a focus on high potentials and leadership development and investing in your top performers rather than investing in everyone. And I'm not saying that they don't invest at all in everyone, but it's certainly a disproportionate investment in leaders and high potentials. And I wonder sometimes whether that's part of what leads to the disconnect, is that everybody isn't equipped with those same skill sets of expectation setting, feedback, development, accountability. They're not given that same training, that same understanding. And of course, their brains are processing their experiences from totally different perspectives.
No, I agree with you. And one of the things, again, that I like to do when I assess is I even see organizations, whether it's intentional, and sometimes they say it's not, but I feel like it is when I've gone in and worked with them, but even unintentional, a lot of times I'm going to circle it back to the performance management and performance systems we talked about before, is within that performance management process, I see those intertwined sometimes, and I'd like to keep them separate for the exact reason you just mentioned. To me, those are two separate things. And succession planning and hypos and all that stuff, those are important things and absolutely important initiatives that I get to work a lot with as well. But to me, when we're talking about your performance day to day, your job, current job, that's what performance management is about, currently what I'm asking you to do. Those resources and like you mentioned, investment, whether it's in training or in leadership development or systems or new computer, whatever, that can look different ways. To me, those should be separated because I need to really put a lot of focus in the day-to-day because that's what's getting the business going on right now. Now, there is a time, and those conversations for leadership development in the hypo should absolutely happen, but I like it to happen separate, or making sure that people understand that when those conversations happen, they're distinct and they should be separated out. And I definitely don't want those involved in any kind of rating potential or whatever we're talking about in that rating system as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes to mind or that I think is interesting around this development, and people and performance is how much individuals are actually getting equipped with those skills. What training is in place? Is there certain things that you recommend or in your experiences you've seen work really well in training or developing the broader organization around some of those key performance capabilities?
Yeah, as far as best practices, I will tell you, I feel like we mentioned like how much things are changing, and I think this remote hybrid world that so many of us have been thrown into or are currently working in has really shifted and really thrown a lot of that in flux. I feel like organizations before that, are a lot of organizations, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of organizations felt like they probably had a better handle on some of those things before. But now that employees are more out of sight, out of mind, you're not interacting with them, don't see them constantly, I think some of that because maybe it fell on the back burner, or because maybe leaders don't feel like, managers don't feel like they can assess as good well maybe as before what some of those skill sets are. I think that has been a detriment, maybe why we're seeing more gaps. As far as works, I think this goes back to some of the strategic work that HR should take a huge role in doing. Is a lot of times that starts at the top and with execs, is looking at the current skill set of what's needed, what jobs are we hiring for, what are the skills needed for those individual jobs. But the challenge is sometimes we're hiring for what we need right now, and in a year that's going to be different. And we need to hire now, which is great, but we haven't assessed with how some individual roles have changed or will change, because we know plan changes of a direction the company's going, whatever. So I think engaging in those conversations earlier with execs and leadership, saying, let's look at the roles within your department, within your organization, current skills, and et cetera. How are they just going to change, and what does that look like? You mentioned some of the industries I've worked in. One of the things we really had to assess during the pandemic, I worked in with healthcare. I was working with a healthcare organization at that time. And as you can imagine, when the pandemic hit, healthcare got turned on its knees. And some of it was just the influx of people, obviously, with the pandemic and everything like that happened. But a lot of skills had to change as well. Nurses, physicians, they were being now asked to do some things that maybe we had started to dabble a little bit in, when you think about telehealth and things like that, that required some different skill sets that maybe they weren't used to. And most nurses and most physicians get into that field because they want to help people, and that's the purpose, mission driven of the work. But they're also usually pretty good at the empathy piece and being able to connect with people when they're at the bedside and doing things like that. It's a lot different now when I'm trying to do that through a screen. And so that was some of the conversations we had with the leadership of the healthcare organization. Was, what are some of these new skills that nurses may need? And yeah, we're constantly hiring, and there's always going to be need for the bedside, but we also, for some of these positions, may need to start looking at what are the people that have some growth capability and or have an interest. But then too, there's still going to be a need for some people to be able to connect with people through a screen and be able to still make that interpersonal connection. So that's just one example of what I'm talking about.
I think that's a great example. I want to go back to one thing you mentioned earlier and talk about this for a minute before we wrap up, which is the idea of creating these high performance or these peak performing cultures, and what it is we're using to define that, or what it is that we mean by high performing or peak performing cultures. Because one of the things that I think happens, or that I've observed in the clients and those that I work with, is that we start to perceive high performance as really busy, really hardworking, really stress inducing, fight flight type environments. We're just always trying to get everything done and accomplish a million things, and not necessarily thinking about it as, how are we making the best, most wise decisions? how are we solving problems in the most effective ways? How are we accomplishing or increasing the results or outcomes of our business versus just driving productivity? And thinking about that in how we look at performance in people, because we know that people aren't going to make their best decisions when they're in a really stressed state. They don't have access to all those neural networks, or the impact of those kind of very different environments. I'm just curious, with what you've seen, what you've experienced, as to what it is that organizations are really looking for, and also maybe what they actually really need, or what you're seeing there.
Yeah, what they're looking for is exactly what you described. Get more done. We got to produce. We got to produce. And I think that's pretty common. And like you said, is the need is exactly what you reference. Is, to me, you're speaking my language as far as the work I like to do is this continuous improvement. We talked about going full circle. Is sometimes it's about how can we leverage technology, systems. AI is a big thing now. It's the new thing that's in people's constant minds. Is it going to replace my jobs and replace jobs and do things like that? And so what I think about is how can we leverage some of those things to get what I call some of those things that task and work that maybe people don't like to do as much anyway. And to me, that's where the opportunity is, where we can get more productive, is I can still free up your time to do the work that's more valuable of your time, utilize your skill sets and your abilities, which goes back to some of that autonomy piece of really allowing you to utilize your people skills, your critical thinking, your decision-making skills better. And the way this is even hitting home now is, and the way we're trying to look at it is, for example, is this: how can we leverage AI within HR to do some of those things that just take up our time of scheduling interviews, of reposting and rewriting job descriptions constantly, and doing some of those things. AI can do some of that work for us. And now that's going to open up our talent acquisition reps and our specialists and our recruiters to really do some of the good work of being able to screen candidates better and really get a focus on some of those skill sets. We talked about skills that are really needed, trying to dig in more to do some of those skills, because they can spend more time doing it, because we're not asking them to do some of these other things that maybe they were being asked to do. So that's just a really simple example within the HR world. And to me, again, is it's leveraging that continuous improvement processes and systems and things like that to take some of those lower level task and skill, I don't want to say skills, lower level task and things that need to be done and that are important to be done. Let's get those away. And by doing that, it makes it less stressful on me. I'm not being asked to fill up every second of my time, and I'm not being measured about how many postings that I post today. It's going to be more about the quality of the hires, and we can really get at that's going to drive performance for organizations.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with what you said there more. And I think that conversation and having leaders really start to consider whether what they're driving for when they think about high performance or peak performance organizations is really what they want. What is that really? Is it really the most productive, or check the most boxes, get the most things done? Or is it achieve really great outcomes and results, and stop assuming that those two things are one and the same?
Yeah, and it's not sustainable. As a pretty basic standard, I can crank stuff out of you, and that's maybe good in the short term. Long term, that's not going to be good for either one. One, we're going to see burnout quickly, engagement's going to go down, morale, all those good things, and then you start looking at retention issues and things like that. And then two, let's be honest, from an organizational standpoint, in the short term, I might get some productivity out of that. In the long term, again, if they leave, that's not productive. But even if they stay, I can't keep that up. That pace just is non-sustainable in the long term. Again, freeing up and making sure that you said that these aren't the same things. You're not going to get both. I always joked, and going back to my L&D days and training, you can, when you would request training and we talk about those things, they want it fast, they want it cheap, and they want it great. Sometimes those things don't always align, and we have to really talk about what's more important to you. Sometimes it was fast, but you have to understand that I may not be able to give you the best product or the absolute most awesome thing, because we have to get it out next week. All right. So if that's the most important priority, we can live with that. And to me, it's going back to that same principle and concept when you talk about organizations, is let's talk about excellence and what that looks like, and how does that look like here, and then let's drill that down into departments and divisions and what that looks like, and as far as work and how it gets accomplished.
I absolutely love this. I think you and I could probably talk about this for days and hours. Any final thoughts as we wrap up this conversation around performance management and people in the workplace, and maybe any words of wisdom you want to offer our listeners?
No, final thoughts for me is it's an exciting time. I've been in this field for 20 plus years and it's always evolved and been moving. But right now, to me, is an especially exciting time because of all the changes that are happening. And again, going back to what you said earlier, that can be uncomfortable and that's okay even for me. But to me, there's just so much to learn and there's just so many opportunities to explore and it's not going to slow down. I think that's pretty obvious. And I think the more we can embrace that from an HR professional, people management side of things, if we take that approach and just know that the change is going to happen, I think that just allows us the opportunities then to leverage some of these things that we've talked about today to really produce the results for the organization. To me, again, if you just simplify things, it always goes back to the single principle. It is always operating from decisions, design standpoint, making changes, whatever it is, with the people in mind. If we keep that in idea and simplify things and just bear it down to how does this impact the ultimate individual, I think that's always going to lead you to success in that way. So
I love it. That was an incredibly valuable wisdom and advice from somebody who's got certainly the experience and the background to just bring a tremendous amount of valuable information and thoughts on this topic. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming on today. To all of our listeners, I just want to leave you with a final thought in thinking about your performance culture and your organization. What is it you really want to achieve in terms of that culture? How is it you're going about achieving it? And is it aligned with, and how is it aligned with the people and the way that humans perform so that you really can be successful in getting those results? And so if you take the time to really intentionally do that and build that, you're going to see and reap the rewards of doing so in the future. So once again, Jason, thank you so much for coming on. To all of our listeners, I just want to remind you to always keep evolving, keep growing, keep recreating and rewiring those neural pathways so that you can live your best life, so that one day you can look back on your life and think, I've lived an exceptional life. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back again next week with another episode.